I'm Angela Oguntala. I'm a futurist and a partner at Grayspace, where we apply foresight and design to systemic challenges to help build meaningful futures. We blend futures thinking with design and innovation to explore, for example, futures of work, of money, of health, of play. And futures thinking allows us to see and assess what shape these possible futures can take. And we do that by making sense of what's changing in the present, what's likely to change in the future, and then critically, what do we want to see change so that we can make visible what choices, what options we have for those futures. And then design and innovation allows us to take those options and to make them tangible, to design them, to prototype them, to test them. And for us, these disciplines and mindsets, they need each other and they complement each other because we can't innovate for and we can't build what we couldn't even imagine or have the foresight to see as viable alternatives in the first place. Organizations find value in our approach in three ways. The first is in our diagnosing of the present, which is where we work to make visible exactly what is changing or why change might be necessary. The second is in envisioning what that meaningful change, what those new directions forward, what that desirable future can look like. And the third is in transition thinking, which includes innovating and experimenting to move us from where we are now to where we want to be. We are currently advising companies on managing uncertainty, which is considering the very near and far future realities your organization might have to contend with, to think through exactly how do we adapt to radical change and how can we be proactive in the face of continuous change, because the future is not a destination. New ones emerge every single day. And so what does it mean to actively engage with that uncertainty? We are also advising companies on innovating with purpose, which is not only about innovating for what's new and what's next, but is also about thinking more systemically about the consequences, the values, the larger futures that our innovations will contribute to. And clients right now are also asking us for help in building processes and structures for collective imagination, which includes embedding foresight capabilities into organizations so that it is not a small team or one precious person's job to spearhead ideas about the future, but so that instead it really does become a shared skill and a shared responsibility in that organization. Collective imagination is a necessity for building futures. And we have had for a long time now a deep decline in our collective imagination, where we find it much harder than in the past to imagine together meaningful or radically different alternatives for our futures, where we can look at each other and say, if we want this, we can build this. But we don't find it hard at all to imagine existential, inevitable threats and collapse, which I think is reasonable, is warranted in many ways because we can see some of our systems fracturing. But a shift is also happening, and it is partly because of this realization that it is a necessary shift. And it's partly because of the reality of living through this pandemic and seeing things change before your eyes. But it is a shift towards building this collective imagination that demands of each other to ask, how do we turn those existential threats into existential choices for better ways to work, to consume, to build technologies, to shape our communities? And this is a transformative mindset shift that will deeply impact organizations and everyday life. It's important to innovate during uncertain times because that is exactly when people and systems are more porous, when we are more willing to think about how things can be done differently because our reality or our comfort has been destabilized. And that is when we see new ideas, new questions, new visions for the future flourishing. And I think that is what we are seeing now with many people starting to question, starting to have these larger conversations about some of the deeply rooted myths and stories we've held collectively about what good work, the good life, what progress looks like. And in having that questioning and in having those conversations, really starting to experiment and to innovate with different versions of those concepts. And I really do believe that if we all don't in some ways see this as a responsibility, this innovating through uncertainty, see this as a mandate in some ways, both individually and collectively, then we will inherit on the other side of that uncertainty. We will inherit and have to live inside of someone else's world entirely with all of the consequences that brings. I think the starting point here is to reframe or align on what optimism actually means in the first place. Because optimism should not be defined as what's frictionless and familiar, as if you are somehow being negative or a pessimist to critique or to make visible why something is failing us. Because only through critique and only through someone first saying, no, we should not accept that, or no, that's no longer working for us, can we open up the space to innovate and to think about alternatives? There absolutely can be friction in optimism. I think that's what good optimism actually looks like. Making hard choices optimistically by accepting the trade-offs you're willing to make to reach a higher purpose. And so the point of optimism should be to move us towards a sense of action, agency, responsibility to create the outcomes we believe in. Not to say, don't worry, be happy, or don't think about the uncomfortable stuff. I think Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia sums it up best when he says, there really is no difference between a pessimist who says, don't bother doing anything, like it's all a mess, it's never going to work anyway, and an optimist who says, don't bother doing anything, everything is going to turn out fine. Either way, nothing happens.